The house was quiet on that summer day in Boston. The open windows let in distant sounds from the busy avenue, but inside, everything was still, as if time had slowed to a crawl in the hallways. Henry Morgan, her father, was hurrying away. "I'll be back soon, Emma," he shouted. She heard the sound of the door closing and the echo of his footsteps on the sidewalk. Loneliness was not unusual for Emma. It wasn't unusual for her father to be away on business or out with friends, but something different happened that day. Visitors had arrived, people Emma had only heard about from her father's snippets of conversation or brief mentions at dinner parties. She knew only vague details, their role in her father's life, their impressive reputations, but little else about their actual personalities. A tall man with gray hair and a deep voice with a strong charisma. He was the kind of man who could take over a space with a single glance, but until now, he had only been a distant figure at her father's meetings. Richard remained silently in the living room while Emma went up to her room. His presence in the house didn't bother her, at least not until their gazes happened to meet in the hallway. Something made her freeze for a moment, but she dismissed the sensation as fantasy. Lying on the bed, Emma flipped through her phone, trying to distract herself, but the heat and silence made the atmosphere even more oppressive. After a few minutes, she realized that she had left her phone in the kitchen. She took a deep breath and had to go downstairs to get it. Emma thought it was nothing, but the thought that she might run into Richard made her inexplicably anxious, trying to ignore the tightness in her chest. Richard stood at the window in the living room, watching the street. His shoulders were tense, his posture straight but not rigid, and his expression was inscrutable, as if he was deep in thought. The sunlight streaming in through the window emphasized the faded features of his face, giving it a quiet tension. His hands were shoved in his pockets, and his eyes were staring off into the distance. As she walked past, he turned slightly, but didn't move from his seat. "Forget something." His voice broke the silence, the low and unhurried timbre making Emma freeze for a moment. She clutched the phone in her hand, feeling the unexpected weight of those words. "My phone," she answered quietly, already turning to go back to her room. "Do you often stay here alone?" Richard asked casually, but there was something different in his voice. The question sounded innocent, but the way he asked it gave off an unsettling feeling. Emma paused for a moment without turning around. "Daddy will be back soon," she said, and walked up the stairs with quick steps. Back in her room, she locked the door. Her heart was beating harder than usual. "Why am I reacting this way?" Emma thought, looking at the phone in her hand. Sitting down on the bed, she tried to convince herself that nothing was wrong. Richard was just an old friend of her father's. Perhaps he was just being polite and curious about the house and the routines of their lives. Regardless, the feeling of unease did not go away. She heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs. They stopped in front of her door. "Emma," Richard's voice came from the other side. Her heart nearly jumped out of her chest. Emma froze on the bed, clutching the phone as if it could protect her. Richard's voice from the other side of the door sounded calm, but everything inside her tensed at the sight of the message. "He's going to be late. Can you wait here?" Richard asked as if it was the most common thing to ask. Emma looked at the door, not knowing what to say. Her heart was pounding in her chest. "Can't you at least stay in the living room?" she said, trying to keep an indifferent tone. "Sure," he replied with a slight smile in his voice. She stood up and walked to the door, quietly turning the key in the lock. Now she knew for sure that no one would enter without her permission. She returned to the bed, but couldn't focus on anything. The thoughts in her head were jumbled. Her mind kept replaying the scene of Richard standing in the hallway, and his voice piercing her consciousness. She heard a faint creak and looked through the keyhole. Richard was standing in the hallway, looking at a picture on the wall. It was an old picture of her father as a child at a family celebration. Richard's face was pensive, as if this moment from the past had awakened some memory in him. "Time flies," he muttered to himself, not taking his eyes off the photograph. Emma couldn't help herself. "What are you doing in there?" she asked through the door without leaving the room. Richard turned his head slightly in her direction and replied in a calm voice, "Sorry, I was just looking at the picture. You were so little." "It was my father's birthday," Emma said after a pause. "I was 7 years old at the time." Richard was silent for a moment, as if choosing his words. "It seems like it was yesterday." His voice became softer, almost warm. Inside, she turned the key and slowly opened the door. Richard stood beside her, but made no move to come closer. "Would you like some water?" offered Emma unexpectedly. She didn't know what else to fill the silence with. He smiled weakly and nodded. "If you don't mind." Emma walked down to the kitchen, feeling her hands shaking slightly. "You're exaggerating," she thought as she poured water into a glass. "It's just a friend of her father's." When she returned upstairs, Richard was waiting for her in the hallway, leaning against the wall. She held out the glass to him, and their fingers touched for a moment. That brief touch made Emma's breath catch. "Thank you." A silence ensued in which there seemed to be nothing but the two of them. "You've grown up, Emma. You're a real woman now," he added after a moment, and his words echoed in her head. She felt her cheeks heat up. "Time for bed," Emma muttered, trying to distract herself from the sudden rush of emotions. Richard smiled, but didn't say another word. When she closed the door again, this time locking it twice, she stood leaning against the wall for a long time, listening to the footsteps moving down the hall. Some moments in life happen unexpectedly and make us feel things we don't expect, but these moments are always followed by choices that determine who we will be next. Emma's story is a reminder that our instincts often tell us the truth before our minds realize the danger. When something doesn't seem right, it's not just an accident. We need to trust ourselves and set boundaries where we feel threatened or uncomfortable. It is important to remember that personal boundaries and self-respect are strengths, not weaknesses. No one, not even the closest family friends, should violate these boundaries. If you ever find yourself in a situation that causes you anxiety, don't be afraid to say no and find support. Trust is something that takes years to build and is broken in seconds. Take care of yourself and remember that your safety and inner peace should always come first.